This is History for the Reckoning, a podcast that dives deep into the history that's hard to hear but critical to understand. Season 1, American Concentration Camps, the story of World War II Japanese incarceration. Welcome back to the podcast. Last episode, we learned about the courageous men and women who resisted the government's unconstitutional actions in various ways. But it bears investigating. Was the U.S. government aware that their actions might be, or definitely were, illegal? To help us answer that question today is our incredible guest, Eric Muller. Eric is an author, teacher, and legal historian currently at UNC Chapel Hill. If you watch any documentary about Japanese World War II incarceration, Eric is in it. He's written numerous books on the subject, which we'll link to in our show notes, as well as created his own podcast and at least one museum exhibit. Eric Muller, thank you for joining me today.
I'm very happy to be here, very happy to do this podcast and talk about, this subject that's of such great interest to all of us.
Thank you so much. I want to start by going broad scopes in the history of the United States, trying to establish, was Japanese incarceration just one step in a long history of what the U.S. has done and perhaps will continue to do, or how much it stands apart? So the biggest example that sticks out is the treatment of Native peoples ever since European colonists have arrived on this continent. So to what degree do you see the Japanese incarceration experience to be set apart from or similar to those previous acts?
Well, we can easily add to the list, chattel slavery. There's plenty of things that we can add to the list of race-based or race-inflected persecutions across American history probably from the get-go. So it's a little bit difficult to place Japanese American removal and incarceration neatly up alongside any of the historical examples, which is not to say that there are not important points of contact and similarity. And the most important point of contact and similarity is, of course, that in one way or another, all of these episodes, episode makes it sound short, slavery went on for a couple of hundred years.
Right.
All of these episodes share a kind of othering of a group that is marked as a minority group that is non-white. Of course, the definition of white has changed a little bit over history, so we have to be a little bit careful when we use a term like non-white, but certainly the way we currently use the term white, we're talking about non-white peoples. And they share, they're all inflected in the kind of racial control that white, chiefly Protestant people have exerted since the Mayflower landed. So they certainly share those points of contact. They share others as well. Obviously, there were contexts within the U.S. government's treatment of Native Americans that involved mass uprootings of people. We only need to think of the Trail of Tears as the best known example, but there are countless others. The notion of rounding people up and confining them in one space obviously shares a great deal with that history. The idea of breaking up families, of removing children, separating children from parents. There's aspects of Japanese American removal and incarceration that arguably share certain aspects there as well. So we can certainly line it up and we can find points of similarity. But it's also, any historian has to think about not just the similarities, but the differences. And, one of the central differences is that this period was a period of declared war in which the United States was, in fact, attacked by an enemy power in the context of the Pearl Harbor attack, and then obviously was at war within days with Italy and Germany as well. It is not the case, I don't think, that had the Japanese never attacked at Pearl Harbor and had there been no war in the Pacific, I don't think it's the case that Japanese Americans would have been rounded up, would have been removed from their homes. That's not to say that Pearl Harbor was the trigger for it. It wasn't the cause of it. The causes of it were, you know, racism and hysteria and all of the things that I'm sure many of your listeners know about. But Pearl Harbor was a triggering event. It's not as though Japanese Americans were sort of careening towards a kind of confrontation with the government that would have led the government to round everybody up and throw them into concentration camps.
Mm.
And you know, that's different from the situation with African Americans who were brought to
Right.
this country and enslaved. Essentially, it's essentially, you know, the same we could say for Native Americans. So, you know, there are differences, there are similarities. I always feel that it's very important, probably most important, for us to understand each of these episodes on its own terms.
Mm.
That there is, of course, much that we can learn about the way in which these episodes echo one another. But I also am often cautious about the claim that history is repeating itself when maybe, you know, to use that well-known cliche, you know, maybe what history is doing is sort of faintly rhyming
Sure.
rather than repeating itself.
So in many ways similar, in many ways different, but I totally get your point that we have to look at everything on its own. The word merits obviously doesn't apply here, but on its
Demerit.
own
Let's say demerit.
factual. Yeah. Well, speaking of careening toward conflict, in the 20s through 30s, America already had a strained relationship with Japan, to say the least, already felt that war might be imminent. What do you feel like were some of the groundwork actions, if there were any, that the U.S. was already taking pre-Pearl Harbor that paved the way for later incarceration?
Well, it's very, very clear that U.S., to some extent domestic, but mostly military intelligence services were surveilling Japanese American communities in the United States and also, you know, also other communities. It wasn't just Japanese Americans, but in the event of war with Japan, for obvious reasons, the government would have been most concerned with the ethnically Japanese population in the United States. So there were efforts by intelligence agencies to develop lists of individuals and also organizations that might be seen as subversive or likely to take or engage in some kind of action that was contrary to American national security in the event of a war with Japan. These were some folks are familiar with the ABC lists, which were developed by intelligence agencies and including the FBI, that basically rank ordered lists of individuals and groups that would be of concern in the event of a war and perhaps appropriate for action against them in order to protect American national security. So there certainly was surveillance. There certainly was military preparation. Obviously, there were,
Mm-hmm.
you know, they were wargaming war with Japan since the 1920s, if not earlier, and preparing action plans for what the government would do, what the military would do in the event of some sort of Japanese attack. So, sure, there was definitely surveillance that was going on.
Sure. I wonder if you have any inkling of when someone started to say out loud that mass incarceration, should a war happen, would be on the table. Was that pre-war at all?
Oh yeah. There is a famous quotation that from Franklin Roosevelt in, I believe, all the way back in 1936, that Greg Robinson talks about in his book By Order of the President, which is something that if listeners have not read, you should absolutely grab if you want to understand Franklin Roosevelt and his views and policies towards ethnically Japanese people in the United States. There's a famous quotation from 1936 in which Roosevelt actually flings around the word concentration camps.
Oh, great.
He speaks of the notion that it might be a good idea to round people up and put them in concentration camps in the event of conflict. So Is that a proposal for mass incarceration? No, it's not.
Mm,
It certainly was, it was a president kind of spitballing, is the way I've always understood the comment.
mm,
I've seen no evidence that there were contingency plans that had already been developed before Pearl Harbor that sketched out the existence of the system of camps that was created in the wake of Pearl Harbor. And in fact, sort of in some ways, it was the absence of any prior planning of that kind that led to the process of building the assembly centers, so-called assembly centers, where Japanese Americans were housed in the summer of 1942, and then the more permanent so-called relocation centers run by the War Relocation Authority in the late summer to fall of 1942. The reason that was such a herky-jerky process and was that the government, in some ways, both the Army and the WRA, once it was created, were somewhat caught flat-footed, needing to kind of
oh,
make things up, on the spot. There was no set of schematic plans for a concentration camp that they could just go to some government file cabinet and pluck out and say, here's how we do
sure.
this, here's how we build them, here's how we move people around, here's how we determine who they're. There wasn't such planning, and so they kind of had to make it up as they went along.
In one sense, that's very relieving to hear that they had not already planned this, but in another sense, yeah, we see the results of that being hurried and mistakes were made and things like that.
Now,
Turn,
mind you,
sure.
I want to say it's not the case that the government was without examples.
Mm,
Right. I mean, the government knew how to build prisons. Like the military knew how to build prisons. There had been POW camps, and there had been enemy alien detentions in World War I, for example, which would have been in recent memory
right.
for people in the early 1940s, relatively recent memory, anyhow. And there were the treatment of Native Americans. One of the agencies that was involved in the operation of the camps, or at least a couple of the camps early in the period, was the Office of Indian Affairs,
Oh, really?
which ran for a period, well, which in collaboration with the WRA, War Relocation Authority, ran the Poston camp and had significant interest in the Gila River camp because both of those were on uh, Native American reservations. So,
Right.
there were experts in the mass treatment of racial minority groups that were at hand, but that's not the same thing as saying that there were pre-planned,
Mm,
sort of, diagrams of what Heart Mountain White would look like or something. They didn't even have sites. They had to scramble to find the
right.
sites where they could even put the camps. So that indicates that there was, certainly no pre-planning for that.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Turning to Roosevelt, Executive Order 9066, when he wrote that, he signed it, he put it out. What legal cogs did that set in motion? First off, what on a high level, what did it do? And then what happened directly after?
Yeah, so I'll answer that in a moment because I
Okay.
want to. It's very common to leap to Executive Order
Mm,
9066 because that's the one that was the legal order that was the foundation of the period that we come to call removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans. But it's really important to remember that it was not the first wave of detentions, arrests, and incarcerations that
mm,
occurred. There was the prior invocation against um, people, Japanese aliens, Italian aliens, and German aliens of the Alien Enemies Act, which
yeah.
was a completely different source of authority that existed since the late 18th century and had been used in other wars between the 18th century and December of 1941. So the period that we think of as Japanese American removal and incarceration includes everything that followed on 9066, but 9066 didn't happen until February of 1942. as
Right.
as early as basically the second week of
December 8th.
December
Yeah.
in 1941. The FBI was running around, using the Alien Enemies Act um, um, uh, to arrest Issei leaders in the Japanese communities on the West Coast, and there were also simultaneously arrests of German aliens, a significant number of German aliens, and a much smaller number of Italian aliens. So that the reason I think I raised that, partly for historical accuracy, but also because of today. We are in a moment where the government has, for the first time since December of 1941, essentially, invoked the Alien Enemies Act to arrest and try to deport. So current events have brought the alien enemies detentions back into the focus, um, and sort of moved them a little bit more to the forefront. And the 9066 stuff has not been as germane in the current moment because the government is using this Alien Enemies Act as the
Right.
basis for these detentions. So, with that caveat that we need to remember about those first
Yeah, let me
detentions.
interject a question there
Yeah,
then, because we already had an episode with Claudia Katsuyanagi who told us all about the DOJ camps as separate from the WRA camps. So when the FBI was doing the rounding up of Issei starting December 8th and for the next couple weeks, is that where they ended up, and were those completely separate from a legal perspective from the WRA
totally,
camps?
totally distinct.
Mm,
Totally distinct. Different bases of legal authority and different administrators, different agencies were
okay.
responsible for these things. The Alien Enemies Act is a federal it's a federal statute that is enforced by the United States Justice Department. And so the arrests of alien enemies were handled by the Justice Department, and were run through the Alien Enemy Control Unit in conjunction, of course, with military guards and so on.
Mm,
So the Alien Enemies Act was a Justice Department affair. The 9066 based removals and incarcerations in the spring and summer of 42 on through the beginning of 1946, all of that stuff was run initially by a civilian branch of the Army, the Wartime Civil Control Administration, which was responsible for setting up, for the removals, for getting people out of their homes and onto the buses and trucks and getting them into the so-called assembly centers that they were responsible for building. And then the custody of Japanese Americans was transferred to the War Relocation Authority, the
mm,
WRA, who was responsible for receiving those people from the assembly centers into the 10 permanent camps that the WRA was responsible for building. So you really have
wow.
you have two different legal bases. You have the Alien Enemies Act, Justice Department. Then you have 9066, which is initially the Army, and then
Oh,
it's transferred over to a newfangled, sort of bespoke agency that was created just for this purpose.
wow.
That was the WRA, which came into existence in March of 1942,
Yeah, tell
which
us a
was
little bit about
completely
how.
separate from the Justice Department, had nothing to do
Yeah.
with the Justice Department.
So can you give us a high 3,000 foot, 30,000 foot, a high level overview? How did the WRA get formed? How did they come to be in such a short time?
Well, I mean, there was so once the magnitude of the removals that 9066 had authorized started to become clear, it became clear that there were needs to engage in extraordinary logistical somersaults to actually affect this planned for this expected uprooting and removal. It was clear that the the Alien Enemies Act was not going to be applicable to this group of people. So the Justice Department's alien enemies operation was not a candidate. The Justice
Mm.
Department also had, as many people know, the Justice Department in the days in January into early February of 1942, they were duking it out with essentially with the Army behind closed doors about whether the mass removal of Japanese Americans was necessary. The Justice Department's position, including the FBI, including J. Edgar Hoover, was that they had the problem of security well in hand, and that mass removal was unnecessary, that much more
Mm.
targeted removals might be, sort of a couple miles around an army base or something, that might be necessary and appropriate, but that uprooting the entire population was not necessary. And basically, the Justice Department said, like, we'll defend this in court if we have to, but we're not running it. We're not going to run these things. So the
Wow.
Justice Department was out of the picture in terms of the administration of these camps. And it was clear at that point that some agency within the executive branch was going to need to take it. And the WRA was created in mid-March of 1942.
So sorry, what you
Really
just said was
for
incredibly interesting. That there already were these backroom, I'm gonna call it, negotiations going on. At what level was this happening? Is a president in the room? Like where?
the
Yeah.
president. No, the president was not in the room.
Okay.
The president was never in the room. The evidence that we have of the president's involvement in this entire process is slight.
Mm.
He basically the conflict that had grown up between the Justice Department and the Army was brought to Roosevelt. It was brought to him by Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, and Roosevelt's involvement was basically to say, do what you think you need to.
Okay.
Be as reasonable as you can, but do what you need to. So he kind of, I don't know, it's wrong to say he broke the tie, but he was the one who kind of had the final decision. But it was not something that he was focused on. It was not something that he was
Sure.
thinking deeply about. And it's not surprising because he had a two-front
He had
war
stuff to do. Yeah.
that he was trying to deal with, and all of the attendant problems. So
Yeah.
this
But isn't
really
it
went
interesting
on.
that he did side with the military in this case? So he
Oh yeah,
thought there was an exigency of security
yeah.
to act in the way that they thought was best. Why do you think that? Yeah. Why didn't the Justice Department prevail?
The Justice Department didn't prevail because they were outmaneuvered.
Okay.
They were the War Department was moving ahead with plans, while the Justice Department was still thinking that this was an open question for debate.
Sure.
They were kind of presented almost with a fait accompli when they actually got into the final meetings. We're talking here about um, it's not the Secretary of War and not the Attorney General, but the people just beneath them. So that
Okay.
sort of second level of leadership within the Justice Department and the Army were the ones that were kind of duking this out and fighting over this. And the Justice Department was simply outmaneuvered. Henry Stimson was also a deeply, deeply respected figure. He was an older man. He was already, in leadership positions in World War I. He had Roosevelt's trust and he had Roosevelt's ear. So I think in the final analysis, Biddle wasn't there going toe to toe with Stimson in the Oval Office. And so I think that the Army just got the inside track and ran on it.
The military outmaneuvered the Justice Department. They were able to get the president's ear. The president signed off on this massive logistical enterprise. So, what happens then? Who has the authority to create the War Relocation Authority?
Well, the War Relocation Authority is created within the office of the president, within the executive office of the president.
Mm.
In the administrative structure, there are independent agencies that we're hearing a lot about these days, right? The ones where the president is firing the heads of them and so on. But there are certain agencies that actually sit. They're not outside of the office of the president. They're within the org chart, you might say, of the office of the president itself, the executive office of the president. And the War Relocation Authority was created by an executive order, just like 9066, by the president by signing an executive order. And they recruited Milton Eisenhower, the brother of the general and later president, to be the first administrator of the War Relocation Authority.
Wow.
So his job was at that point to develop to begin developing plans for how Japanese Americans would be housed, how their time would be occupied, how they'd be fed, how the entire morass of details. He was responsible also for helping the WRA to interface with other agencies that were playing some role in this process. So interfacing with that WCCA, the Wartime Civil Control Administration in the Army, interfacing with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, which was dealing with a lot of things having to do with property problems as Japanese Americans were being uprooted and removed. And dealing with other agencies, and I'll mention also, of course, the Office of Indian Affairs, which was very interested in having a role in this process as well. There was a fateful meeting so March is when the WRA is created. Milton Eisenhower steps into this role. In early April of 1942, there's a meeting in Salt Lake City that is convened between the new War Relocation Authority and basically the governors and attorneys general of the various states around the Mountain West, where it was hoped that Japanese Americans could be relocated. And the War Relocation Authority's plan. The War Relocation Authority was it's hard for us to get this into our minds today, but they were progressives. They were New Dealers. These were liberal, progressive jailers. In the context of the government,
That's a great quote.
In the context of the government at that time, they were routinely ridiculed by the military, by other sort of intelligence agencies, by Congress. They were ridiculed for being a bunch of soft-hearted, academic, liberal, squishy do-gooders. And it's hard for us to get our minds around the idea that the WRA, which we think of as a villain, because they were the ones that were running these camps, as being seen as a bunch of softies, but that was the context in which the WRA was operating. So basically, they wanted to create these kind of open camps that were kind of like civilian conservation corps camps, places where Japanese Americans would have freedom of movement and where they could basically harness their agricultural expertise in service of the war effort. They bring this idea to the Western governors and the Western attorneys general, and with the exception of the governor of Colorado, Ralph Carr, all of the governors say, "You've got to be kidding us. Forget it. Not going to happen. We are not here in Wyoming or Montana or Idaho. We are not going to accept the West Coast's problem being dumped into our states." I'm using their language, of course.
Right.
If there's such a security risk on the West Coast, why should we receive them? The only conditions under which we're going to receive these people is if they're put into concentration camps. Forget this. Forget these open gated places. Not going to happen. We will accept them only if they're brought in under armed guard, if they're put behind barbed wire, and if they're also driven back out again when this is all over. So Milton Eisenhower has a very sobering day that day. His plans for a kind of more progressive vision crumble, and he realizes that he's going to be in the job of building basically prisons, what we would today call prisons.
Yeah.
And so they kind of have to then rearrange their plans, and they begin scouting sites. They begin trying to find locations that would meet a variety of criteria about, sufficiently isolated, but also not too isolated that it's impossible to get provisions and supplies in, and also near major transportation routes, train
Right.
tracks, and so on, so that people could be. So they begin scouting all over the place to find either federal land or state land or even privately owned land that could be used for these purposes.
So you
It
mentioned, yeah, that there was a shift here between we were essentially going to build a ghetto, like a separated town versus a concentration camp. Now they're forced into the other. From a legal perspective, where do you know if there was any shift in their thought? Did they anticipate the same level of legal challenges? Were they already prepared?
oh, I
Before this
think
meeting, what were they thinking legally?
yeah, it's to be honest with you, I really am not sure what the legal conversations in those first. We're talking here about like 3 weeks, right? We're
Right.
talking about
Yeah.
mid March until April 7th is really kind of what we're talking about here. So I don't know what the initial legal thoughts were. It was plain to everyone. The Justice Department and the new solicitor of the WRA, a man named Philip Glick, who came with Milton Eisenhower actually from the Department of Agriculture, which is where many of the top leadership of the WRA came from. They knew from the get-go that if they're going to be arresting people and removing them from their homes, and they're going to be confining them in any way, that there were going to be legal challenges. It was never in doubt. And you can see evidence from the very earliest days that they are planning with an eye towards what might have a better chance of passing legal and constitutional muster.
Okay.
But once it becomes clear that these are going to have to be, closed down, guarded facilities, at that point, the WRA obviously and the Justice Department recognize that there are going to be challenges, that habeas corpus petitions will be filed, and that the way they design the program needs to be aware of the fact that courts would ultimately be scrutinizing what they were doing.
Right. Okay, so sorry, back to where they're scouting out for locations, and they're doing this under the auspices of the federal government, not the military, correct?
Yes, the WRA at that point was the one that was responsible
Okay.
for doing this searching. They would have involved, they would have involved other parts of the federal government, like, if they could find land that was owned by managed by the Bureau of Reclamation, let's say, or an American Indian reservation, let's say, then they could basically begin making plans for using that land if they could enter into memoranda of understanding with those agencies about the use of the land. Those were that would be a much easier thing than having to condemn and buy, basically a whole bunch of private property,
Mm,
or try to get, the states to give up or surrender access to or lease state lands to the federal government for those purposes. So
right.
there were other agencies that would have been involved in this, but it was essentially the WRA's task to bring off this process of planning and then ultimately construction of the 10 concentration camps. What many called, and we today commonly will call concentration camps. With the important footnote that when we use that term, we're not trying to invoke the image of the Nazis' camps
Right.
in Europe that housed and ultimately murdered millions of Jews and lots of others as well.
Yeah. So that makes complete sense then why the lion's share of these camps are Arizona, Utah, Wyoming, Northern California, that kind of thing. You already mentioned the Alien Enemies Act that the Justice Department invoked. Were there any existing laws or statutes that, as they anticipated legal challenges, they were ready to lean on?
No, they made it. No, 9066 was made up out of whole cloth.
Okay.
It was made up out of whole cloth. And that's why it's important to distinguish between the Alien Enemies Act arrests and detentions on the one hand, and the 9066 arrests and detentions on the other, because whatever we might say about how lousy the process of treating alien enemies was, how sloppy it was, how all it took to be deemed suspicious was to be a Japanese language teacher or a Buddhist priest or the head of your Japanese business association. However
Mm.
lousy that process was, it operated according to law. It was based on individual suspicion, not much suspicion, bad suspicion in most
Right.
cases, but still, it's not like they just went around running through, through little Tokyo and looking for Issei and saying, you and you and you and you and you, all of you come with us. They were targeted. It was a couple of thousand people. And then once the people were arrested and detained, they were given hearings. And the majority of the individuals, the hearings were no models of fairness, but they did end up leading to the release of more than half of the people that had been arrested.
Wow.
9066 was done under Franklin Roosevelt's war power as commander in chief, but that was it. Like there was no other statutory basis. There was nothing else. And there was also no individual suspicion. That's what marks 9066. Unlike the Alien Enemies Act arrests, the 9066, all it took was to be of Japanese ancestry. Didn't matter if
Mm.
you were a citizen or an alien. The Alien Enemies Act was only for aliens. 9066 was aliens and citizens alike. And then once you were arrested and detained, you're stuck, you're in limbo because there's no right to any kind of individualized hearing to
Yeah.
establish that you are not, in fact, a security risk. So that's what, I think that's a really important and often overlooked distinction between these two forms. Now, I will say, as soon as Franklin Roosevelt signed 9066, Congress did snap into action and passed laws to back up and provide funding for and to enforce orders that the military would make under 9066. Public Law 503 was a law that was passed within days of 906 that made it a federal crime, civilian crime, to defy an order of the military leadership that was issued under 9066. So Congress did back up 9066 with a variety of laws and fund appropriations. But those were after the fact. 9066 itself was basically a free-floating exercise of the president's executive power as commander-in-chief.
Yeah. So you mentioned that his order applied to aliens, but also citizens. In a lot of the literature you read about this, it's pointed out how the language used was aliens and non-aliens, meaning citizens. Yes. I've always wondered, is there any kind of legal anything behind them using that phrase, or is that just a psychological propaganda choice of words?
There is no such thing under the law as a non-alien. That is not a legally, was not then and is not now a legally recognized category. I think it was that was chiefly the military that was using that language of non-aliens. That was not the WRA. That was not WRA. Again, they were the progressive squishy liberals, right? So they were not using that kind of language. The military was, and I think that, as you say, I think it was just a way of kind of denoting the separateness of this ethnic group or this racial group. And therefore aliens and non-aliens seemed, I guess, to do the trick.
Yeah. You mentioned that Roosevelt had wartime powers, war authority. Is there a legal distinction there? I know there are certain things that a president can try to do when there's war and there isn't. But are there a host of laws that the moment we say, boom, we're in a war, I can do these things now that I couldn't have done before?
Absolutely. I mean, there are existing laws on the books that give the president the power to do a whole variety of things under pursuant to the war power. 9066 was not among them. 9066 was this spontaneously generated thing. It was not. There was no existing statutory framework that Roosevelt could or did site in 9066 to ground the action that he was directing the military to take.
Sure. So one thing that we've already mentioned from a previous episode between Pearl Harbor and the assembly centers is curfews, confiscation of different personal belongings of Japanese Americans prior to removal. Who ordered that? Under whose authority? And
That
it'll
was
come
the
up later
Army.
in our Supreme Court episode, so it's really
Yeah,
important
no,
to know.
that
Yeah,
was
where did it come from?
that was the Army.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean that um, it was the Army that ordered the curfews, and then it was because of those laws that I just mentioned that made it a crime to defy them. It
Mm.
was civilian law enforcement authorities that were responsible for actually enforcing the curfew. So,
Oh,
Gordon
interesting.
Hirabayashi was arrested, Minya Sui was arrested, Fred Korematsu was arrested by civilian authorities, not by military police,
Interesting.
because it was civilian authorities that were responsible for enforcing those criminal laws.
Mm.
If Franklin Roosevelt had declared martial law along the West Coast, as he did in Hawaii, and suspended the operation of the civilian courts for these purposes, then then the police and the FBI would have been out of the picture, and it would have been the military's enforcement arm that would have been responsible for
Wow.
that.
You mentioned the meeting of governors. They already had this predisposition to intensely distrust this group of people, the Japanese Americans and the Issei. What was the propaganda? What the particular to the removal? So, what kind of messaging was given to the American public around the removal of the Japanese?
Um, that this was that well, it depends, I guess, who was doing the talking. Certainly, the large segments of the press were out there doing their own interpreting of these actions, and both reporting and editorializing about the extreme military necessity, because gosh, Japan was about to invade the West Coast, and we know that Japanese Americans, or all of the caricatures that we know were bandied about in the press, all of the derogatory caricatures. Um, the War Relocation Authority um, depicted its own actions as sort of regrettable, regrettable, but militarily necessary
Mm.
impositions on Japanese Americans. So everybody grounded their arguments in military necessity, on the theory that the reason Japanese Americans were being removed from the coast was because there was this imminent threat of invasion, and in the event of an invasion, Japanese Americans could not be trusted not to engage in subversion and espionage,
Mm.
and blow up bridges and do dams and do whatever, and also would be very difficult to tell apart from an invading army because of the characteristics of appearance. So that was a pretty uniform view across all of the government at that time. You also see some little bits and traces of evidence about how Japanese Americans might be at risk of
Oh, interesting.
vigilante action along the West Coast.
This is
Of
for their
course,
own good argument.
yeah, that's the for their own good argument. That argument is nonsense. If Japanese Americans were at risk, the thing that law enforcement is supposed to do is protect them in place,
Right.
not completely uproot them and destroy their lives and remove them inland. And then, of course, their own protection thing, as is very commonly stated, at Heart Mountain, the searchlights and guard towers were looking in, they weren't looking out. So that
Absolutely.
was a make weight argument, I think. But you do see little wisps of that in some of the government documents at the time.
Yeah, so you said it depends on who's talking. So who were the parties that actually published messaging to the public?
So the WCCA, which was the civilian unit of the Ninth Army, which was John DeWitt's operation out at the Presidio, they had a communications arm, and they were responsible for communicating about communicating to Japanese Americans, putting the notices, those we see the famous footage of those notices to persons of Japanese ancestry being tacked up on. That was the WCCA that would have been
Mm.
responsible for those notifications and for enforcing those notifications. And also, they would have been, the go-to agency for reporters who were seeking to understand what it was the government was doing.
Interesting.
Once custody or once control shifted in the summer of 1942 over to the WRA, then it was chiefly the WRA that was responsible for public messaging about what these camps were, why they were being created. If listeners are interested, you can go to YouTube and you can search for Milton Eisenhower propaganda film, Japanese Americans. Those search terms will bring up this, I don't know, 16 or 18-minute black and white propaganda film that the WRA created to try to explain to the country what it was that they were doing and why. And needless to say, it's a puff piece. It's not.
Right.
It's not. It doesn't take a critical eye towards what the agency was doing, even though the agency, it's very clear, had plenty of people in it who were deeply troubled by what it was they were actually doing.
Mm.
But that was not a face that they showed. Obviously, that's not a face that they showed to the public.
Sure. So turning to when the WRA is handed this over 100,000 people that they're given care of, you have, I believe, your most recent book, Lawyer, Jailer, Ally, Foe, which discusses the legal situation of individuals in the camp, and particularly the placement of these white lawyers into these concentration camps to serve ostensibly the inmates.
Right. Well, partly. So you might think of the legal situation as having two essentially independent tracks during this time period, 42 into 43. There's the track that's focused on defending this program against the habeas corpus petitions and the Fred Korematsu challenges, the Gordon Hirabayashi challenges. That was a Justice Department responsibility.
Okay.
The Justice Department is the government's lawyer agency. So when the government agencies are challenged, their actions are challenged, it's typically the Justice Department that will step in, certainly at the higher level courts, and provide those services. But it's clear that they were working in close conjunction with the WRA lawyers as well, on that axis or that track of how are we, as we develop these programs, how are they unfolding, and what's the best way to design them that will give them the best chance of being successfully defended in court.
Yeah.
That was one track. But then there were the camps themselves, and people often forget that this track existed at all. But you've got 125, whatever it is, thousand people of Japanese ancestry who are, confined in what are effectively 10 small cities over a period of years, and their lives go on. Like, they continued to have, they continued to have legal lives, you might say. They needed wills. They needed divorces. They needed to work out child custody. They needed to try to fend off efforts by shysters on the West Coast who were trying to fleece them of their property that they had left behind. They needed to create corporations that would be recognized under Wyoming law or Arizona law or Arkansas law to, run the stores in the camps. They needed to create judicial systems for processing petty offenses. They needed help. Long story short, they had complicated legal lives. And so the WRA installed at each one of the camps an individual, a white lawyer, who was called the project attorney. And the project attorney's responsibilities were simultaneously to be advisors to the camp administration, right, about how to run the camps, social control, how to handle strikes, how to handle, uprisings and so on. That was part of their job. But they were also simultaneously running these legal aid offices for the prisoners,
Wow.
and helping them with their income taxes, helping them with lapsed insurance policies, helping them find divorce lawyers in the surrounding communities who could handle divorces and child custody arrangements, who could draft will. Like, so they were in this weird position, these lawyers, where they were simultaneously um, jailers, but they were also in other contexts advocates for the imprisoned people themselves. And that's really what my most recent book is about. How
Oh,
did these lawyers, whose records that have been left behind make very clear that they thought these camps were unfair and unnecessary, um, how did they work through this constant mental gymnastics of trying to figure out where their loyalties ran, um, how they should function, um, where their consciences were nagging at them about this larger enterprise that they were in, and where they, had plausible stories that they could tell themselves about how they were helping in some ways. Because
sure.
the truth is that they were like, they were hurting and helping. They were hurting in the
Yeah.
sense that they were instrumental to the operation of these camps. They were essential to the whole system of social control. So they were hurting big time. But they were also helping Japanese Americans kind of get through at least certain aspects of the ordeal, in
Jeez.
ways that were genuinely helpful, in ways that genuinely bettered the lives of the prisoners. So it's a very murky, very complicated, very sort of morally ambiguous space that they occupied.
Yeah. A fascinating story to have looked into. So I encourage everyone to pick up Eric's book, which we'll give a link to in the show notes. So as the war progresses, as it becomes increasingly clear there were no evidences of, much less widespread sabotage, of any sabotage on the West Coast of
Right.
this dangerous populace, how did the legal situation change over the years?
Well, so the most important thing that happened is that the WRA, for a variety of reasons, ended up deciding, within a period of months, having brought everybody into the camps, that it was important to find ways to start getting them back out again.
Okay.
This is the so-called leave process, and the mechanism that they developed in order to facilitate Japanese Americans leaving Manzanar and going to a job in St. Louis. Just to pick a place, pick places at random. Um, they created this. They created a system they called relocation. They created an office, and they set up satellite offices in Chicago and a few other places to try to facilitate the remove the eastward exit of Japanese Americans from the camps. They could
Mm,
only do that if they could assert that the people that they were releasing were loyal, in quotation
right.
marks. And so that was where these notorious loyalty questionnaires, that was a big part of where these notorious loyalty questionnaires of the spring of 1943 came from. That was
Yeah,
the
so we've already
system.
had Freykabe tell us all about that particular chapter. I wonder if you can tell me, was there any legal authority by which to reassign, repartition people based on their answers to these questionnaires? You mentioned maybe they couldn't leave camp if they couldn't, but sending people to Tule Lake, things like this.
No.
Okay.
Next
Yeah.
question. I mean,
I'm with you, yeah.
no. I mean, this is. I can't emphasize I can't emphasize enough how improvised this was. There was no pre-existing legal framework that permitted the separation of people and the further or tighter confinement of some American citizens, because they had answered questions wrong on a questionnaire. That just, they were making it up as they went along.
Jeez.
Um, And similarly, the whole process of, you know, the motions in both directions, the movement eastward for the people who passed the tests and the movement northwestward for the people who, quote unquote, failed the tests to Tule Lake, both of those mass movements were made up by the WRA as they went
Mm,
along. Obviously in consultation with the Justice Department, because they knew that these things were going to have to be defended in court. But still, it was all made up. It was all on the spot, extemporized.
geez. So I guess speaking of which, we mentioned in our episode about the resistors with Frank Abe how they had to prove that they were prisoners in order to prove that they were in prison. So when I think of it as a famous episode is Frank Emmy goes to the guards and says, "I'd like to leave now, please." And they said, "I mean, you can try, but we will shoot you."
Yeah.
So suggesting that there was a very clear authority that he could not defy in order to do that. What is your reflection on what happened there? What were the soldiers
Well,
acting
I mean,
under?
so this was important. I mean, the WRA was, this ended up being legally significant,
Mm,
in a big way. The WRA was creating a permissible system for people to leave, which was the leave system, the leave clearance system that included these loyalty questionnaires and interviews and all this stuff. What Frank Emmy was doing was he was trying to leave outside the context of the framework that the WRA had set up.
mm,
And that was not okay. Like that, that was the only way you could leave was with a pass from the WRA. He didn't have one. And so he could not leave. That detention, that detention was ultimately the undoing of this system in December of 1944 in the case called Ex parte Endo, Mitsuye Endo's habeas corpus challenge to her confinement at Topaz. What the Supreme Court decided in December of 44, on the same day as it decided Korematsu, which upheld the mass removal of Japanese Americans on the basis of race from the West Coast, the same day the Supreme Court released its opinion in Ex parte Endo, in which they said that the WRA, whatever power they may have had to detain people initially, once that person passed the loyalty test, any power that they had to continue to try to confine those people exceeded the authority that the WRA had been granted. And
mm.
so that on December 18th of 1944, that's when the Supreme Court basically rang the death knell of continued incarceration, because the camps were full of people who had passed the loyalty tests but had simply not pursued an exit to the camp.
Mm,
And those people, the Supreme Court said, you might have had authority back in the, fall of 1942, even into 43, to keep all these people detained. But once you created this system to process them and sift them on the basis of loyalty, your power to continue to detain them lapsed some time
right.
ago. And so that assertion of authority to keep people in after they had passed their loyalty, after they had answered yes, yes on their questionnaires, that was the undoing of the whole program ultimately in December of 44.
Okay. So at what point, how long after that is the actual administration shut down and how did that happen?
So the camps, as early well the mass exclusion of Japanese Americans from the West Coast ended at the end of 1944. So as of January of 1945, the process shifted from a program of mass exclusion to a program of individual exclusion.
Okay.
The Justice Department could identify specific people in the camps that they wanted not to allow to return to the West Coast. But those were specific individuals. It wasn't everybody. So
Yeah.
the West Coast was reopened, and simultaneously, the WRA began announcing that the planned closing of the camps. And that was ultimately effectuated by basically October, November of 1945.
Okay.
All but Tule. By November of 45, all of the camps except for Tule Lake had closed. Um, it was not an easy process. The WRA had to close the camps because paradoxically, you'd think that like people in the camps would have kicked their heels in glee at the idea that they could leave the camps freely. But lots and lots and lots of people didn't want to do that because they had nowhere to go. And
Right.
they had lost most or all of their financial resources and their real and personal property. And camp was at least a safe place. They got meals, they had a roof over their heads. To go and especially to return to a very hostile West Coast
Right.
where who knows what kind of shots were going to be taken at them from, drive-by shootings and vigilante violence. Lots and lots of people stayed in the camps in 1945 because they didn't know what else to do. So the WRA needed to really start kind of putting the screws to the community to make it less pleasant for them to be there, shutting down mess halls,
Oh, okay.
shutting down certain, sort of civil service, civilian services, um, moving people, out of barracks, making them move into tighter and tighter areas of the community to basically try to signal to them like, okay, folks, it's time to go. And there are some heartbreaking scenes of the basically the last trains to leave the camps in the fall of 1945, where some people, some Japanese Americans, literally need to be physically placed onto the trains. Um,
Jeez.
because they don't want to go. They're terrified. They don't know where to go. They don't know what they're going to be facing when they get back to, or they get to wherever their destination is.
Oh.
There is a piece of writing called Last Train Out of Heart Mountain that a white woman who was, I think, working for the WRA, it was sort of her chronicle of the process of organizing and then sending off this last train. And it's just a heartbreaking piece of writing. Because you see the bewilderment and also the courage, of course, but just the bewilderment and the bereftness of this community that has been stripped of everything and is being basically, frog marched out of this one place that they knew they were safe.
Yeah. You mentioned the WRA camps at that point shut down. The DOJ camps did continue, yes, because Crystal Lake is still open into 46.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. No, there were certain alien enemy detentions that continued past the end of the war and past the end of the WRA's existence.
You also mentioned that many of these people had lost massive sums of property, had lost potential, so many things.
Yes.
After the war, there was the ability to apply for a tiny bit of redress. Tell me about what that was,
Yeah,
who authorized this.
that's actually my current research project.
Okay.
Yeah, so I've been digging deep into this for the last couple of years, and hope to be writing about it relatively soon. Congress passed, through significant lobbying efforts by the Japanese American Citizens League, it should be noted. In 1948, Congress passed something called the Japanese Evacuation Claims Act of 1948. And what that did was it authorized the Justice Department to make payments to Japanese Americans who could submit documentation of identifiable property losses of certain kinds.
Okay.
There was no confession that what had been done was illegal, unfair, unjust. It was
Mm,
seen as a kind of act of magnanimity by the
sure.
government to recognize that, in fact, yes, indeed, people had lost a lot of property. And so basically the claims division of the Justice Department had to stand up very quickly a unit within it called the Japanese Claims Section,
Oh,
which
wow.
was lawyers mostly in DC, but they also had offices initially in Los Angeles and then ultimately also in San Francisco, that were responsible for receiving these claims. They created a claim form. People could fill out the claims. Lots of people got the assistance of attorneys in doing this. And it was a little bit of a works project, actually, for the small cohort of Nisei lawyers that had, in the years after the war, many of these claims were filed, large numbers of them, by individual Nisei attorneys who were entitled to a small percentage of the rewards from the government as their own attorney's fees. And so this system, suffice it to say that it was not run in a magnanimous way, that it got tremendously bogged down right from the get-go, got tremendously bogged down in processing. There were 24,000 claims that got filed. And the office had, like, I don't know, 20 people, 30 people. I mean, it was a tiny office that was supposed to administer 24,000 claims. And so it just bogged down immediately. Like, it took months for them to even issue their first check. And within a year, they had done something like, I don't know, 50 or 70 cases, just tiny numbers of cases, because they were treating them like little legal cases with proof requirements and hearings, and you had to have receipts. And so it got so bogged down that in the early 1950s, Congress amended the legislation to allow the Justice Department to settle cases for anything under $2,500. So anybody who was willing to strike a deal with the Justice Department for an amount less than $2,500 that the Justice Department would authorize, those cases would get settled. And that went. Then it started to go very quickly. Then lots and lots of people began to settle their claims for much less than the claim amounts, right? These were settlements. These were not, it wasn't like they filled out their claim for $1,250 and the Justice Department was like, oh yeah, that's less than $2,500. We'll write you a check for $1,250. Not at all. It was, I agree to relent on my application for $1,250. I'll accept $300.
Wow.
So a lot of people cashed out. They needed the money. They desperately needed the money. So there was, and this is part of what I'm writing, the argument that I'm going to be making in this piece that I'm writing, that in a perverse way, this ended up like recapitulating the system that Japanese Americans had found themselves in at the end of 41 and the early 42, when they're having to sell their stuff because they're under financial pressure and they're having to take $50 for a $300 car. Now the government comes along 10 years later and says, we'll compensate you for the car, but because it takes them so long to actually get any of this done, Japanese Americans have to then say, okay, I'll take $50 for the $300. It's like, it's the same thing all over again.
Really, yeah.
In a very, very perverse way, in a very sad, a very tragic way, I think. But it takes a decade, a full decade, for these cases finally to be fully processed. They left for the very end some really large claims, like tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars for major, like, agricultural operations and stuff. Those ended up actually being decided, some of them settled, and a few of them had to be decided by a court, the Court of Claims. But it wasn't until the early 1960s, actually, that they finally wrapped this process up. Yep.
15 years to get, geez, that's crazy.
Yep.
I think the last legal thing I'd love to ask you about is into the lake particularly, but across the camps, there was encouragement to choose to renounce your citizenship, to say, I'm no longer American, you can ship me back to Japan. From a legal standpoint, I've never heard how that came about and how it was justified. Yeah,
so it was born, the Renunciation Act of 1944 was, it eventuated from the fact that Tule Lake had become a violent, unsettled place, not just because the government was clamping down control, but because within the Japanese American community itself, there was a lot of conflict over loyalty, over are you Japanese or are you American? There were, gangs that were roaming around the camp that were causing violence and beating people up, and it was a mess. And the government, and for those people at Tule Lake who were U.S. citizens, the federal government had no lawful way to remove them further, to further confine them.
Right.
Particularly because if they didn't have proof against them, but they just knew that they were like members of these gangs or whatever. So the thought was, you know what? There's this Alien Enemies Act. If we create an opportunity for that small group of Kibe, the Japanese Americans, U.S. citizens who'd been educated for a significant chunk of their lives in Japan, this Kibe group, if we can create a vent that will allow this smallish group to renounce their U.S. citizenship, then they'll be, then they won't be U.S. citizens anymore. And then we can use the Alien Enemies Act and we can grab them and we can put them in Justice Department detention and we can ultimately deport them. That was the thinking, right? That was the thinking. The trouble is that the Justice Department drafts the law, Congress passes the law that allows a U.S. citizen to renounce their citizenship on U.S. soil, which is something that was not possible up until then.
Okay.
Initially, smallish numbers, as predicted, renounce their citizenship. But then the government announces that it's going to close the camps. And all of a sudden, Japanese Americans are like, whoa, wait a minute. What are you going to do to us? They were thrown into this tremendous uncertainty. And so thousands of people begin renouncing their U.S. citizenship under this law, which was never expected by the Justice Department.
Okay,
never
I didn't know that part.
Yeah,
so this
never
is
expected.
After the announcement the camps are closing, based on fear of the aftermath.
Yes, fear of the aftermath. It was a way. Many people saw it as a way of trying to assert some control over their own circumstances.
Wow.
And of course, there's also tremendous pressure that's being applied within the camps within Tule Lake by the pro-Japanese element to kind of enforce a kind of Japanese patriotism in the camp and a Japanese identity in the camp. So with all of these factors, lots and lots of people end up renouncing their citizenship. And all of a sudden, the Justice Department has this huge problem on their hands, which they have like, I don't know, I remember 6,000 applications to renounce citizenship. And they need now to come up with a way to process those. So they...
Another bogging down in the other direction, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just every way you look, they're just having to kind of make up systems on the spot. I didn't even mention earlier when we were talking about that loyalty test, it's often thought that the only way that the government determined who should pass the test and who shouldn't was on the basis of the answer to those answers to those two questions, 27 and 28. Yes, no. But in fact, it was much more complicated than that, because you had this whole questionnaire with lots of answers. And so what the WRA did is it created this little bureaucratic system to try to translate the answers on all of these thousands of questionnaires into findings on loyalty. So they created like a point system. You know, if you had played Little League Baseball, you got plus points. If you had been a practitioner of judo, you got minus points. If you spoke English fluently, you got plus points. If you didn't speak English, you got minus points. If you were Christian, you got plus points. If you were
a good one, yeah.
Yeah, if you were Buddhist, you got a tiny, small minus. And if you were Shinto, if you were a practitioner of Shinto, well, forget it. You were never seeing the light of day. So there was this whole bureaucracy that was created to process the loyalty questionnaires and translate those into actionable judgments. So it wasn't just 27 and 28 that determined who was deemed able to leave the camps and who was going to be sent to Tule Lake. It was a more complicated process than just that.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for answering all these questions. It has really shed a lot of light on this entire situation. What is your advice to people that in the future, or perhaps now, might find themselves part of a large machine like the WRA like the military enforcing these rules. What's your advice toward people looking at their own situations?
Look, I mean, hopefully none of us will ever be part of a system of American concentration camps. I hope that none of us ever finds ourselves in that position. But we are all members of or beneficiaries of lots and lots of structures in society. And they can become invisible if you don't practice some self-awareness about those. And think about, what are my lines? Where are my ethical red lines? I'll take one example, which is going to seem frivolous, I think, to many people, although it doesn't to me as a pescatarian. American society deeply depends on the system of factory farming, which is environmentally disastrous and causes a great deal of suffering to a lot of living beings, right? We're all part of the American factory farming system.
Right.
We are. Like, we don't think about it that way. We think we're going to Safeway and buying a steak, but we're all, or a chicken leg, but we're all part of that system. So am I, right? Because I eat fish, and, the farming of salmon is a pretty ugly operation as well. My point here is not to compare factory farming to Japanese American incarceration. It's simply to say that we are all in our lives moving through systems and beneficiaries of systems that, if we really paid attention to them, might trouble us. And so I think that the solution here is not to shut down, is not to engage, is to work against the human instinct to partition things off. This is just a steak. I'm not going to think about what's going on, how this was produced. Work again. That's what gets people into trouble in all of these kinds of systems. There's evidence of this sort of thing in Nazi Germany as well, like where the evil is an even more extreme evil of actually shooting people, murdering people. People found ways to compartmentalize. I'm just the person who's scheduling the trains. I'm just the person who's, I'm the engineer I'm just the person shoveling coal into the engines. I'm just the person offloading the people at the, I don't know where they're going. That kind of segmentation and willful blindering ourselves from the larger systems that we're part of is a deeply, deeply dangerous, very human mechanism. So I think our best strategy is to try to awaken ourselves to those things so that we'll at least have the chance to think about where our lines are. If you don't see that you're in a troublesome system, you don't have to worry about lines. You just live your life. But if you can try to raise your gaze enough to see the larger system that you're part of, then choices appear. Then you're in a position where at least you can be making choices. Do I want to do this, or is this something that I don't want to be part of? And then, in that sense, that cultivation of a kind of awareness, I think, is a very powerful tool. Unfortunately, it ends up making our lives harder, right? Because it awakens us to kinds of agency and choice that we have as human beings that we usually prefer to kind of look away from and not really want to know that we have. So I don't know. I don't know whether that was a satisfying answer or not, but that is the way I think about it.
I think it was the perfect answer. Thank you so much, Eric Muller. Thank you for coming on, and may we all consider the wider system we're a part of, and especially not shut ourselves down from seeing what's right before our eyes in many cases.
Exactly.
Thank you again, Eric Muller.
Thank you.
Season 1 of History for the Reckoning is made possible by support from the JACL Mount Olympus chapter, as well as generous financial support from the Takahashi Family Foundation and the JA Community Foundation. The music was produced by Patrick Coffin. If you want to support the show, follow us on Instagram at History for the Reckoning. sign up for our newsletter at History for the Reckoning on Substack, where you'll also find the show notes for each episode, or support us financially through Patreon at patreon.com/historyforthereckoning.